Hey everybody, welcome to Mr. O's class. We're going to go over 5 limits of government today. We've been working on this in class a little bit, and I want to give you a refresher in case you were not clicking, if this wasn't clicking in your head, or in case you just wanted to do a little bit better if we were going to have a quiz, which actually we are. So let's get after it. 5 limits of government. So when we talk about government and the 5 limits of government, one of the things that we always want to do is control whether or not somebody can come in and kind of take over, make everything go crazy, get all the power and make rules and laws themselves and really destroy the functionality of a government. We want to protect against that. And that's what the 5 limits of government are doing. Really, we're trying to, just like it says, limit the government. We don't want to limit it so it doesn't work, but we want to limit it so that one person can't mess it all up. And that's really the idea behind the 5 limits of government. Now, first limit of government is the Constitution, and it limits government by creating rules. You know, no longer do we have to guess what type of government we are going to have. We can see right here in our Constitution, it's our rule book for what's happening. And so when we have rules established in our Constitution, then that will limit somebody from coming and kind of making up rules as it goes, or as they go. So a Constitution limits government by creating rules or laws. It's our rule book. It's our kind of playbook. And so that's going to be our basic idea behind the Constitution. Next up, rule of law. And rule of law is going to limit government because it is going to make sure that all laws are enforced. Laws are enforced. Laws are fair. And maybe most importantly, laws apply to everyone. So even the president, even the leader, even the highest, most powerful person in the country, the rules that were stated in the Constitution and any other rules are applied to them. They have to follow those rules and those laws too. And so this rule of law means that, hey, everybody has to be bound by the law. People can't just say, no, this person has to follow these laws, these people don't. That's not the way it works. If we have the rule of law. And that's how it limits government, because it doesn't allow people to decide who gets to just get by with whatever. So rule of law, it limits government by laws are enforced, they're fair, and they apply to everybody. Now, let's talk about the rule of law just a little bit more, because the rule of law, if you remember, is what we based our skits on, and order and security was one of the rules of law. And if you remember from our skits, that was the robber. They came up, they were afraid to go out at night, and they ended up getting mugged, and they couldn't find a police officer. And once they did find a police officer, there was nothing the police officer could do. So the rule of law there, order and security, didn't happen in our skit. But hopefully, if it's done properly, there is order and there is security. The police officers are trained, they know what to do, they know how to respond and how to help. Second thing is kind of a big word, legitimacy, and that's whether or not the laws are enforced. We've said several times that you could have lots of laws on the book, but if nobody pays attention to them, then they're worthless. So the rule of law also means that it has to be legitimate, or the government has to be able to enforce those laws. Checks and balances, that was another skit that we did. If you remember the president skit with the legislators, and the president was kind of just deciding that he was going to help his buddy, and he wanted the legislators to help him, and they kind of laughed at the fact of the court system and whether or not the court system, who was supposed to not let this happen, had any power. They felt like they didn't, and they could do whatever they wanted. So too many people, or I guess a small group of people, had too much power because the checks and balances in that skit didn't work. But in the rule of law, we want checks and balances to occur there. Equal application of the law. Remember the town mayor, where one person got busted and then the mayor did the same thing, maybe something worse, and the town mayor got off and didn't have any consequence? Well, that's not equal application of the law, and we really want that in the rule of law. Procedural fairness, our jail cell skit. If you remember our jail cell skit, we ended up having one guy who was there for 2 years, hadn't seen a judge, didn't even know why he was in there, and other people sometimes would come in and they'd get out in a week or a few hours or a couple weeks, and it just wasn't really fair. They didn't really have a way the people who were in jail didn't have a way to understand what the process was. And of course, that's not fair. The last one for rule of law, access to justice. If you remember, we had that lady who had some land, and she had somebody that was farming that land, and she wanted to have she wanted to sue him, but she didn't have access to a court because her local court was always closed, and then she couldn't read very well because schooling wasn't available to women. So when we talk about rule of law, we're really talking about these 6 things needing to be in place. So I spent a lot of time on the second limit, which is the rule of law. Remember, we've covered Constitution and rule of law. So those are 2 of our 5, and this is a little bit more detail in the rule of law. We won't go that much detail into all of these. Next one is separation of power. And of course, separation of power makes sure, and it limits government by making sure nobody gets too much power, especially one group. And in this case, we might talk about, sorry about that, nobody gets too much power. We might talk about the president, making sure the president doesn't get too much power, making sure Congress doesn't get too much power, and or the courts. And everybody's kind of balanced. Everybody should have the same amount of power. And maybe more importantly, we can check each other. So the president can check to see exactly what Congress is doing and making sure they're not getting too much power. And the Congress has the ability to make sure that they can check on the president. And the separation of our 3 branches in the United States is a good example of this. So let's move on to the next one, which happens to be consent of the governed. And when we talk about consent of the governed, we're really talking now about voting and giving people the right to vote, but giving people the ability to change. And that's one of the ways that we can limit somebody from coming in and getting too much power, is having a process where, hey, if it's not working, somebody's going crazy, we can actually change it by voting them out. And consent to the governed is a big part of the 5 limits. Rights of the minority. Sometimes, we think, oh, well, whoever the most people say, that should go. So majority rules type of thing. If we have a vote and 51 people say we should do it and 49 people say we shouldn't, then we go ahead and go ahead with it. But sometimes we have to remember that there are small groups and there are unpopular groups. And just because they're small or they're unpopular doesn't mean that they should not have a right or a say or the ability to voice what they think. And so when we limit government, we don't want to squash out those small groups. We don't want to squash out those unpopular groups. We still want them to have a say in our process. So really, when we get down to it, again, we're talking about our 5 limits of government, Constitution, and I'm going to abbreviate some of these, and we have our rule of law. We have separation of power. Our 4th one is consent of the governed. And our 5th one is the rights of minorities. So those are the 5 things that we're going to be covering on the quiz. Should give you a little bit of a review, a reminder anyway. And if you have any questions, please let me know. You can just say it right here in the comments, reply, and we can go from there. Thanks for watching. I hope that this helps you. Let me know if it does.